Here, let's. Hello, beautiful people. Today I have a very special guest. She is Australian, a model, a former contestant on The Bachelor Australia, an advocate against bullying, talk show host, co-host of Full Disclosure on HighVibe TV, and most recently a US correspondent and journalist for the Australian online news platform, The Informer. Natalie Sady, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's my pleasure. Are you kidding me? Natalie, so first question, what can't you do?
I can't sing. That is, no. That is the
Really?
other end of the spectrum for me.
Because this laundry list of amazing things that you have done is just wonderful. And I mean, you're such an inspiration watching you the past couple of years of how much you've grown. Really actually inspired me to start, speaking my truth and starting this podcast. You were part of that catalyst. And all jokes aside, I would love to know more about you and your journey and how you got here, A, to the United States, and then B, knowing more about the journey of how now you're becoming a US correspondent and journalist and speaking to the likes of interviewing the likes of like Bigtree, Adam Whittington, our own California Riverside sheriff. What was his name again?
Bianco.
Chad Bianco, the likes of that, doing those interviews and how you got here.
So first of all, thank you for saying that I've inspired you to speak your truth and start having these conversations, because everything that I do, I don't have an expectation when I do it, but I always sort of think if I can affect or help one person, that makes everything worthwhile for me. And that was certainly the logic that I used when I would go into schools and speak for Bully Zero Australia. And that was incredibly powerful for me when I would speak to the students after the presentation and hear their stories, what they're going through, or any realizations I was able to help them make. So that's just an incredibly powerful thing for me. So thank you. Okay, so to start, in terms of my journey, I grew up and I was always modeling when I was in school, and after school, or when school finished, I was working full time. I didn't have the opportunity to go to university. And I always thought that if I wasn't successful with my modeling career by the time I was 18, time was up. There was no way I was ever going to be able to sort of do anything with it. And I'm naturally fair-haired, which sounds ridiculous because everyone looks at me and goes, "You're a brunette." I'm actually quite blonde.
Really?
And yeah.
That's
and so
crazy.
I was really blonde sort of right up until I was 21. And then I decided to dye it dark. And that also was the time when my career took off, which I don't know if that's divine timing. I don't know if it's a hair thing or what it was, but I was working full time. I always had a side hustle because I was trying to invest in my future. So buying properties and things like that. And I always recognized how lucky I was to have the career that I did. I mean, getting to go into a different place every day, not do the 9 to 5, not get caught up in office politics and have that be my existence. And look, if that's something that brings joy to someone, fantastic. But the thought of, turning 18, getting a 9 to 5 and sort of just doing that and being in one place and that being my life, for me just wasn't enough. So I would sit at these jobs and, there's a lot of waiting around when you're in that industry. I was always reading books. I was always trying to educate myself. I was always interested in everything that was going on around me. But I was always in a place of gratitude where I recognized that not everybody had those opportunities that I did, that I was being paid to be able to sit there and read a book and then chat to my friends and then go out and perform on stage for a few hours. And that was it. It's not to say we didn't work incredibly hard. You have really long days and you have periods of time where you work an insane amount to the point that you miss out on so much of your social life and all these other things. So that was my life for a lot of years, but I enjoyed how it always changed. I always had to adapt financially to the cyclical nature of that industry, because you go through really busy periods and then there are periods where there's little to no work. So people would watch me sort of going to the beach and doing things. That's amazing. But then you've got the financial worry. So it was a learning curve to sort of juggle all of that. And that was my life. And 2013, my marriage had ended. I'd been in an abusive relationship. And that the abusive relationship was only a few years. It was about 18 months to 23 months, I think, that we were in the relationship, but I had to live with him for another 12 months after the relationship ended. And I mean, there's a certain amount of abuse that continues when you're living with the person who abused you in such a way. But it taught me so much, and that relationship fundamentally changed who I was. I got myself out of all of that, rebuilt my life, rebuilt myself financially, emotionally, what have you. And in 2013, I found myself single. Everybody in my life was saying, you need to do The Bachelor. I went, don't be ridiculous. I watched that show. I don't go on it. But the universe kept giving me signs. There was a day where I had fallen asleep and I think the TV was on, and I woke up to this ad blaring through the TV saying, are you single? You need to apply for season 1 of The Bachelor Australia. I went, oh my goodness. I was getting phone calls from people. I was getting text messages with signs about it. So one day a girlfriend and I jumped on the phone and we were filling in the application, and the application is huge. And we were so sarcastic because I said, I think I need to do this. I don't expect anything, but let's just fill it in because then the universe will leave me alone. It's fine, no problem. So we did that. I think 3 days later, I got a message because I sent the application in, I think 2 hours before applications closed. And 3 days later, I got a message from somebody saying, are you out of the country? We're trying to get a hold of you. And I said, no, I haven't gotten any messages. And it was casting for The Bachelor. They had already cast in Melbourne, but they liked my application so much that they wanted to meet me. So the very next day at 6 a.m., there was an audition. Then I was flown up to Sydney. And I think a lot of the girls had a couple of months to prepare to go on the show. I had about a week.
Oh, wow. Wow.
And a lot of the girls, being young, were living at home and could sort of just pack up their things and sort out work, but just get on a flight and go. I was 34. I had a house. I had a cat. I had to sort of take care of all of this stuff. And a lot of my clients were saying, well, if you're not going to be here for 3 months, we're replacing you. So I also ran the risk of losing all of my regular clients. And so then it's, well, if I come back from this, will I be able to pay my bills? I did it. I'm really glad that I did. It was an experience. Love wasn't there for me in that show, but it was interesting. And I think you do these things to kind of shake up life and see where it'll get you. So I came back and I knew I was kind of done with Melbourne. I was just bored. And
is that where you're originally from Melbourne?
Yes.
Okay.
And we shot the show up in Sydney. And I came back and I actually reconnected with an ex, because when you're in a reality show like that, there's a lot of deprivation. You're obviously not having any contact with the outside world. You can't watch TV. This is why people get so emotional on reality shows. And when you're watching it going, it's day one, why are you crying like that? You've already been locked up for at least a few days, if not a few weeks. And so emotions run high, and, you add alcohol in there. And if you're hungry or you're sleep deprived and you don't have any sort of outlet where you can go to your family or friends, it's all a sort of a bit of a thing. So I came out and I called an ex. I'm like, hey, I just need to be with some of my people. So that was a thing for a little while. He was an ex for a reason, so that didn't work. And yeah. And so I continued to work. My clients thankfully welcomed me back with open arms, and I continued to work, but there just wasn't the motivation. And I had talked, when I was in the abusive relationship with that partner, about moving to the US, and we were going to move over for his business. And he had started the process of setting up a company and what have you, because he was going to work with some pretty incredible people over here. And then that obviously didn't happen, and we weren't together anyway, so that wouldn't have been an option for me. But all of a sudden it came up again. So in 2015, I started going backwards and forwards and just sort of seeing what my options were. I was training with some coaches over here because I was already making the switch to TV hosting. My ultimate goal was shooting documentaries. That was what I wanted. Everybody assumed I wanted fame and fortune. And it's very hard to explain to people when you've worked in a very, an industry which is based on looks and recognition and what have you, that it's not necessarily fame that you're searching for. But I also understood the industry and knew I needed to build a bigger name to be able to get any sort of documentary that I would shoot out to the wider world. And so I had a plan that I would come over here and I would sort of model and do some TV hosting as much as I could, and in the background be trying to sort of get these other projects off the ground. Thankfully, some opportunities came up over here, and in 2017 at Christmas time, I got on a flight Christmas Eve and waved to everybody and headed on over. I'm not a big person for the holidays. I never have been. And I just sort of went, I'm happy to be jet lagged through it all. So jumped on a flight, came over here, and very quickly, not so much through my agent or manager, but just through my own networking skills, I met some people and I was given some opportunities. I was doing a talk show with a network called Focus TV. And it was through that opportunity that I met the Leo King, who I now work with regularly. And so I had all these great sort of opportunities, and, you know, things were ticking over. I was working with a dancewear brand, Claire the Hurricane, and doing all these things. And it was all great. And then 2020 happened. And so I was sitting there and I made a promise to myself that I would not sit in my house and just watch TV. It's not who I am normally, so I'm not going to do it. So I had a rule that in my house, the TV would not be turned on during the day. And it wasn't. So I got back to reading. I always have a book going, but I wasn't reading as much sort of in the previous few years. And so I kept reading and reading and reading and reading all the modeling opportunities. It was all shoot at home. And so if you don't have an appropriate space for what they're looking for, you can't even do anything like that. You had to be able to shoot yourself. And living
That's
on
interesting, sort of thing, like you shoot yourself in a modeling. Interesting. So what kind of gigs were those? Not to veer off into.
Yeah, no. So there were a lot of things where it was, you know, testimonials, or we want, you know, a photo of you at home doing this. So you would have to send audition tapes and sort of frame it and do all the things. And a lot of the self audition tape, it's always been a thing, but it's almost leveled up now that they've realized we can do this quite efficiently, where we don't have to have a whole day with people coming in and out and not turning up. We put it out there, tell them what we want, which is great in a sense, but I actually prefer just going in, doing whatever it is I need to do, meeting who I need to meet, and going home. And I would call on my neighbors where I could and say, hey, could you come help me with this? But sometimes it's not appropriate, they're not available, whatever it is. And so everything kind of just stopped. So I was reading a lot, walking a lot, just trying to be productive and proactive. And I got a phone call from some people in Australia, some incredible journalists, and they said, hey, can we just do a sort of catch-up interview with you? What are you up to now? Because obviously you're not in the country, so people don't necessarily know. And I said, yeah, absolutely. And we did that. And then I got a call from the executive producer saying, hey, do you want to be our US correspondent? I went, sure. One problem. And he said, what's that? And I said, I don't know anything about journalism. And when I was doing all these courses on presenting to camera and learning how to speak and present and do all these things, they would always do bits on journalism, not so much like you would learn if you went to university or college to learn about journalism and do a degree, but you would learn about how to present these stories. And I was always like, I don't care. This is not for me. This is not what I'm doing this for. I know what I'm doing. And
but yet you had that inkling of, you know, always wanting to do documentaries, and, you know, you had that interest already in you. So it's funny how
it
works.
And I think the natural evolution for me is I'm not interested in I'm not interested in the sort of 5 to 10 minute news segments where this is the story and this is a rundown and that's it. Investigative journalism is where it's at for me. But so they said, no, we'll teach you how to do this. We'll talk you through it and we'll do all these things. And I went, okay. So we started, and it started presenting stories to camera. A lot of them have been removed because we talked about the much maligned hydroxychloroquine very early. I talked about obesity being a major comorbidity with COVID, all those sorts of things, and was just asking questions. Why are we not talking about this? Why are we telling people to stay home and sit on their couch, and they're seeing more fast food ads than ever before, and telling them to sort of order everything? So then they're literally not moving.
Right.
And in a country where obesity is already an epidemic, and you're now telling these people don't move, and rather than saying, hey, you need to keep moving, you need to find a way to move, you're now at home, you should be cooking your own meals, you have time to do all this. So those were the sorts of stories I was covering. I was always trying to find stories that were interesting, that were, there might have been a small headline or a tiny story, but it was being ignored essentially by the mainstream media. And so that was how I found my stories. And then my executive producer said, do you want to reach out to some people, maybe see if you can get some interviews? Sure, who's going to speak to me? And so I started reaching out, and Bigtree was the first person to say yes. And can I tell you, I don't jump around my house and get super excited for things. I ran around like a crazy person with my phone in my hand, just going, like, this is huge. How is he saying yes to me? But thank you. And my producer was kind enough to kind of just let me run with it. I don't think he knew what he was getting. I always over prepare for everything. And
I know.
And
even you with your index cards, I love it. You're just like, you're ready. I love it. I love it.
But even when I'm prepared, I feel underprepared. I feel like I don't know enough. I haven't studied enough. I should have done more. Maybe I should have started 2 days earlier. And the interview with Del was incredible. And he is fantastic to speak to.
Of course. And he was a big advocate for, speaking against the narrative of what was going on with the whole COVID situation. And, obviously with the vaccines, now we can talk about it a little bit more freely. So yeah, the fact that you got that interview is huge.
I think the thing, because I had been following Del on and off for years prior to 2020 starting or anything like that. And my big thing was, he was always chasing truth. It wasn't about just going against the narrative. It was, this makes sense. And when COVID started, a lot of what was being said, I'm just sitting there going, this just doesn't make sense. And if it doesn't make sense, it's probably not true. Whereas listening to the other side, I'm listening to them and going, see, that makes sense. And that lines up with what we know of viruses and how you tackle them and how this all sort of happened. So I sent that first interview off, and my EP called me and just went, what is that? And I said, is it terrible? He goes, it is brilliant. I didn't know you could do that. I went, thank you so much. So from there, it kind of just, it blossomed, and I had an incredible time while I was at the Informer. I actually left them in 2021.
Oh, okay.
And since then I've launched my own platform, and it's tough when you help build a platform on the back of your interviews that I'm incredibly proud of. And some of them are still up there. I spoke to Dr. Sherry Tenpenny. I've spoken to some very pro-vaccine doctors. And I always try to play devil's advocate. I always try and sit on the other side, because I don't think it's about my views and my personal opinion when I'm putting these stories forward. It's about, what does this person have to offer? And if they're coming from a place of truth, they should be able to argue their point and get that across. Because if you're coming from a place of truth, there's not going to be an issue there. And then it's up to the viewer to decide what resonates and what doesn't. So while I was still with the Informer, like you mentioned, Chad Bianco, because he released a video at the time stating that he he would not be answering any calls, or his entire department would not be answering any calls
Or
to enforce the mask mandate. And I was like, this is incredibly brave in a state that is so hardcore. I mean, we were one of the first states to lock down, and it's terrified my family back home. They were calling me saying, you need to come back. I said, I've got an apartment and a dog and a visa, and if I leave, I don't know if I'll be able to come back. So I'm just going to hunker down and figure it out, and it's fine. So I had really incredible opportunities with the Informer, and I learned a lot, but now I'm building my own platform, and the numbers are getting there, and what have you, but it's all just about I enjoy having control over the final edit and how things are put together. I generally don't take anything out of the conversation unless there is a technical glitch, because sometimes if people really if we have a really bad connection, you sort of lose chunks of what's being said. So that's the only time I'll cut out something that somebody has said. But I get to present it the way that it happened. And I get to have control over who I'm speaking to, how long I'm speaking to them for, all of that. And it's about, for me, having very real and deep conversation. So there's that. And then in the background, the Leo King, he and I reconnected, and he was sort of saying, I need a female face for my merchandise. Do you want to model for me? I went, yes. And then there was talk about full disclosure. So we sort of tied everything in together, which works beautifully. And again, it's all about truth and just having the conversations. It's not about David and I are necessarily right on everything we talk about. Yeah. It's about having the conversations and being able to ask the questions without fear of retribution or people sort of coming for you, and cancel culture and all this crap that we're dealing with at the moment. Just being able to have a conversation and say, hey, this doesn't make sense to me. Is it right? Is it true? Where do we go from here? And where is this leading? And then, if my question is ignorant, great, I want to know, and then I can learn and figure out what's actually going on. So that's how I got here. So the journalism thing was never an intentional thing, but it turns out my inquisitive mind serves me very well.
Brains and beauty. I gotta love it. Gotta love it. Now, going back to your family who are in Australia, I know your dad recently just came here to visit. How did you feel seeing the news coming out of Australia? I mean, it was pretty tyrannical, if I can say so myself.
Tyrannical is the perfect word for it. And right now they're backpedaling, saying we never forced anyone to get vaccinated.
Just like Fauci said, I never told the president to lock down. Where there's the video of him saying that, and then there's the video of him saying, we need to lock down. It's just like, what is happening here? Do people, it's just everybody has short-term memory that and they're just dismissing it, sweeping it under the rug. Like, these people need to be held accountable. I don't understand. But anyways.
And Trudeau is doing exactly the same thing. So when I got the phone call saying, hey, you need to come back, because I had, the night we found out we were locking down, I was on my way to a girlfriend's house for dinner, and I was standing at her apartment door, and I knocked, and I was like, hey. She opened the door. I said, they're locking us down. And I'd been expecting it because I had been doing some work for Cleo the Hurricane. And I remember I had Bumble with me that day. It was March. It was really rainy. And I said to her, I think they're going to lock us down and I don't have any food. She goes, what? I said, I've got maybe a meal or a couple of meals worth of food in my house, but being single and on your own, and I would often end up either with friends or out somewhere. So I don't like having too much food because I don't want to throw anything away. And I just said to her, I need to go do a grocery shop. So I left early that day, took the dog, and we went to the supermarket. He sat in the car, and I did the biggest shop I think I had done in years. And just in case, because I didn't know what lockdown would look like. So a week later, I'm at my girlfriend's house and the notification comes through on my phone as I walk in her door. It said, they're locking us down, but tomorrow, not today. And she's like, okay.
Yeah.
And we just kind of had our dinner and things were normal. And so the next day was fine, but my family, the news had obviously made the headlines in Australia, and they were saying, you, like I said, you've got to come home. And I just went, no. I felt in my gut that this was the right place for me, and I just needed to stick it out. In the background, being an expat, there are all sorts of Facebook groups and things like that you sort of sign up when you move over here, and it's really helpful. I'm not heavily involved in the expat community, but these people all talk, and it's a good safety net if you need information or help about how to navigate things. It's really great for that. But in the background, there were scores of people in those groups saying, I have to go home. I'm scared. I don't know what's going on. There are other people saying, I've just lost my job, and if I'm not working, I can't pay my bills. And a lot of these people were very successful people over here in different industries. And so I'm watching that going, oh my gosh, how bad is this going to get? Anyway, I did say to my family, anything we're going through is going to happen in Australia 6 months later. That seems to be the cycle. And they're like, no, we're fine. We've shut the border. We've done this. We've done that. And then it started. And Victoria, where I'm from, was the worst out of all of them. The other argument about going back was, I just said to everybody, I walk 5 or 6 miles a day. I am not going to cope mentally being locked in a hotel room for 14 days. It's just a no for me.
Right.
I would rather just stay put, and I'll see you when I see you, and I love you, and thank goodness for FaceTime and things like that. So watching that go on was really interesting. And it was especially interesting communicating with friends, because I'm speaking to them and saying, how are you coping? And they're miserable. And I'm saying to them, because I'm getting to observe it from the outside, I have a vested interest that people that I love are there and going through it. But I'm not emotionally invested. I'm not caught up in it, I guess is the best way to put it. And so I had people that were kind of like me, and they were pissed, and they're just saying, this is insanity and none of this makes sense. And they're kind of finding workarounds wherever they can, and they're doing what they need to do. And then there are other people that hate it, but the government's doing everything they can for us. And I'm saying to them, this makes no sense. And your numbers are going up. And why, if you're not sick, are you going and being tested? Like, again, none of it makes sense. And that, no. And for a year, I lost some friends because they were so hardcore, and I apparently wasn't sort of buying into it. So that was a problem. And the fact that I would question it, I had somebody tell me that I don't understand medicine. I don't understand vaccines. I don't understand how viruses work. And I'm sitting there going, but I am sitting there saying, I've interviewed some of the leading doctors and scientists in the world. Like, I've been very fortunate through this. And they're like, no, well, they're the wrong doctors. How do you argue with that, right? And it was interesting. So about a year later, after I think the second lockdown, one of my closest girlfriends, because we just avoided the topic, I would just sort of say, how are you doing? Are you going out? How are you navigating these things? And my girlfriend was one of the mums that would take her daughter and son to the playground, and there was a place that was selling margaritas to go in coffee cups. So the mums would all walk to the whatever this venue was, they'd get their margarita in their coffee cup, and then they would go to the park, and the mums would stand around with their margaritas, drinking them. The kids would play. And I'm not a big drinker, but I get it. Anything that's going to give you a little bit of a release and all of that. And so it was around then that I said to her, are any of your friends dying? Does anyone that you know, has anyone been hospitalized with COVID, and has anyone died from it? And then I don't know anyone personally that lost anyone from COVID. I've since met a few, but it wasn't that they died from COVID. They died because against their will, they were administered remdesivir and then vented.
And that just recently came out, that the ventilators, there was a few articles that just came out either today or yesterday. I was reading it that, oh, well, now we're seeing that the hospitals, the people that were on the ventilators, they died from that. It's just like,
Yeah.
oh God, we were saying that, not we, but doctors were saying that from the get-go, like, get these
And
off
that's
the
my
ventilator.
argument to people when they call me and say, hey, did you see this? And I said, this is what I was
Old
trying to
news.
tell you 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And they're like, well, no one was talking about it then. They were being silenced. Like, this is what trying to get people to understand. And so anyway, it was sort of around the time with the margaritas that my girlfriend realized that just because this premier of Victoria, who's equivalent to the governor of California or any of the states, she finally realized that just because he showed up every day and did a press conference, it wasn't about what was best for Victorians. And so a lot of people started to flip at that point. But I mean, a lot of my friends were forcibly vaccinated. And when I say forcibly, yes, they took themselves there and they signed the paperwork. But I have countless stories of friends who were crying as these people were about to inject them. And the nurse would say, are you ready? And they would say, no, I don't want this. And the nurse would inject them anyway. And to me, that's just a horrific thought. But at the same time, these people were not able to survive without a paycheck. They had no other way of paying their rent or eating. And I understand there are people that say, well, you find a way. Yeah. And in some cases you can, but sometimes when you have dependents that are relying on you, you don't have a choice.
Right.
It's one thing to say, I care enough about this situation that I am prepared to lose my home and I'm prepared to live in my car if that's what it comes to, because I don't want this. But when you have little children involved, you have a wife or a husband and you're responsible for their welfare. I get it. And I also have friends who lost their jobs and did have to completely pivot in their life and move forward. And it's incredibly difficult to watch them going through all that. And then they had to watch us go through the BLM riots. And my dad and I didn't speak during that time, but I would send him updates and say, this is where the protests are tomorrow. You're going to see footage of things happening here, there. And I would give him the rundown. And then I would tell him what I was doing, where I was, who I was with. And I would say, I am safe.
Right.
And so
Because
we're all
usually
watching each other.
Yeah, because usually people, if you have not visited California, people think LA is like one little small spot where it's spread out and it's a huge city.
Yes. And also my dad's been here enough times that he understands the layout of the city. So when he saw that the Grove had been torched, he's there, even though he knows geographically it's not right next to me.
Right.
He's there just going, what on earth is going on? And then when they're protesting and looting in Santa Monica, I'm like, it's fine. It's not fine, but it's happening in Santa Monica. It's not here. And then we did have the National Guard here for, I think, 3 days. Mm-hmm. And it's bizarre watching armored tanks roll through your streets. Although my dog loved it. So,
oh, really?
So just a quick detour. My dog was a rescue from the shelter. He'd been found on the street. He'd clearly been loved by somebody at some point, and he was fixed as a puppy. He'd had all these sort of things done. So somebody cared enough and invested money into him. He was found on the street. No one ever came and claimed him, and then in the shelter for the year. And then he got me. So feminine and so like I just wanted to love on him, and he was like, get away. And he loved men, obsessed with David, the Leo King. And so he would get to the studio and just be like, oh my God, where's my boyfriend? And they would go off together, right? When the National Guard were in town, my dog saw the uniforms and lost his mind and ran. And if there was a Hispanic man, he would go straight to the Hispanic man. So my understanding or my guess is, and we'll never know the answers, his previous owner was someone Hispanic or like a Hispanic male in uniform. And he would always go to them, and he was so happy. And it made me sad at the same time because he was never going to find whatever it was he was looking for. But the National Guard were amazing, amazing during that time. So anyway, that's a little.
I remember when they came down. My cousin owns a wine bar right on Rose, and they were really close. And there actually was a shooting on Lincoln and Rose. Something happened there, and everybody like just closed down and just went home. And but yeah, it's such a the beginning of COVID was such an interesting time. I remember going to the beach because I live in the marina. I remember going to the beach and literally I couldn't believe it. A lifeguard is like, "What are you doing here? Go home." I'm like, "Leave me alone." But I actually was sent home. And I was like, "This is ridiculous." And I never really locked down, anyways. In general, I'm in real estate. I'm transitioning out, but we never locked down. 2 months later, everybody's like, "Okay, back to work." We became essential workers, so we never
Well,
stopped working.
and that's the whole thing. And I mean, I didn't really lock down. A lot of my friends didn't want to go out and do anything. But so when the curfews started in California, I would go out, I would take my dog as everybody was sort of going in for the night and they'd taken their dogs for their last walk. I'd get my dog, my taser, and off we'd go. And we would just walk the streets sort of in my area. And people thought I was crazy, but I would see the police and I would wave to them. But the really bizarre thing for me was there were no planes in the sky, so there was no movement above. Even the homeless weren't moving. And I had an entire encampment at the end of my street. So I'm there going, how is it that even the homeless people are kind of locking down? Because if you went around earlier in the day, they would be moving around. It was just the most bizarre time. And I had keys to a dance studio at the time. I would go, I would dance. I had a great time.
Yeah, no, I had a good time. I mean, like I said, it was great going to show property at that time was fast. No traffic, nobody around. Like I was even early most of the time because I pad my
LA.
yeah, I pad my time just to make sure I was there, but was arriving like 15 minutes early everywhere. So, it was a nice time.
It was annoying as people started realizing they could actually move around. I'm like, get off the road.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
so enjoyed you not being here.
It's crazy. Where did I want to go next? Had a question. So, since we know that Australia, Canada obviously is all kind of still run under the thumb of the crown, what are your thoughts on that? Do you think Australia will ever get like separate? Has there been any talks about that?
There has been, and back in I want to say in the 90s, because I don't think I was married yet, but I was with my boyfriend, so it has to be sort of late 90s. There was actually a referendum,
Okay.
and I voted no to not secede from the crown, and his family voted yes. But the reason I voted no was where it meant when you went to elections, you didn't get to choose who you were electing. This was this particular referendum. So you would be able to vote for a party, but not the person to lead your country. So in Australia, it's Labor and Liberal versus Democrat and Republican. And my understanding is
sorry, is it just the two parties like
well,
you have here?
you have independents as well, and they're starting to play a larger role because people are getting really tired of the whole two-party system. So more and more in the houses and in the state, the independents are starting to play a role. The problem is that a lot of the independents will do deals with the larger parties to get vote preferences so that they get voted in. So this is where it sort of gets murky, whereas you get a few true independents and they can shift the balance of power and they can vote according to their own conscience. But it's finding those independents that are genuinely there for that reason. And then we found out in the last election that was held in Victoria, there was a party that was called the Sack Dan Andrews Party, and Dan Andrews is the Victorian Premier. But it came out not long. There were two things that came out. There was a guy that he's considered one of the most powerful people in politics. He works behind the scenes, pulling the strings, getting people votes, hooking up the independents with the bigger parties, all of that. So he has more power than what anybody sort of realizes. And the other thing that came out was the Sack Dan Andrews party was actually going to preference Dan Andrews. So it's this whole mind game of our name says we hate him and we stand against him, and they're banking on people not doing their research and not looking into preferences and getting their vote and then giving them to the person that these people dislike. So it's this weird sort of thing. And I mean, it's this corruption. But so going back to the referendum in the 90s, that was why I voted no. I went, at least this way, we've got the Governor General that we can go to and we can petition, because then they are the people that deal essentially directly with the Crown.
Is the Governor General kind of like the president? Because I know you have, I don't know.
No, so that the equivalent of the president would be the prime minister. But obviously, and not that the Crown, to my understanding, ever sort of gets involved, or at least not that we know of.
Not that you know.
But you've got the prime minister who's voted in. But again, we went through a period of time in Australia where there would be dissatisfaction with the leader. So the party, there would be a leadership spill. And so then the party would vote and be like, no, you're out. And they would put somebody else from the party in. And again, that's taking away, I think that's morally wrong. I think it should be up to the people to vote who is representing them. So we got our first female prime minister through that process. There was a leadership spill, and I'm trying to think which prime minister it was. I can see his face and I can't think of his name. I think it was Kevin Rudd. So the party voted him out and put Julia Gillard in power. And then she wasn't voted in for a second term, or, for her first full term. But so all of that's going on. So the thought of losing the Governor General and being able to petition that and having a president that we haven't necessarily voted in as the head of state, for me was a no. But there's always been a very big push to sort of separate from the Crown. I wouldn't be surprised if it does happen, and especially after the last few years, people being incredibly unhappy with the fact that the Governor General did not step in and stop the craziness that was going on, despite all the information that was sort of being put forward.
Right.
It's, people have sort of had enough. And I also don't think people care about the Crown, and I don't think I think there's a lot of people that don't necessarily like Charles, and especially those that are aware of the whole World Economic Forum and the Great Reset. He's very heavily involved in that. If it was William that was king, would that change it? Possibly, but yeah.
Yeah. It's crazy how the Crown has rulership over so many countries, and a lot of people don't even know this.
Right?
Yeah, they just have no clue. I'm like, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, there's like countries in Africa, I mean, that are,
well, I don't know if Americans know this, but so every 4 years we obviously have the Olympic Games, but every 4 years, but we do it so that every 2 years after the Olympics, so it's a 4-year cycle in that regard. 2 years after the Olympics, there are the Commonwealth Games.
Right.
And it's all the countries that are ruled by the Commonwealth, they get together and have their own Olympic Games. So where Australia is dominant in the pool in the Olympics, so often in the first week we'll lead the tally in terms of medals. As soon as we get to the second week, we lose it because the Americans are so dominant in gymnastics and track and field and all of those sort of sports, and a whole range of other countries come in as well. We dominate at the Commonwealth Games. We're like the big, strong, athletic country. So yeah, so it does give our athletes a chance to compete at a level, and yeah.
There's a silver lining to everything, right?
Right.
Now, you were recently in Boston and were at a big announcement where Robert Kennedy Jr. announced his run for presidency. How was that?
That was amazing. And especially as an Australian, because politics is done really differently. Yeah. And fun fact, I almost missed the entire announcement.
I heard the story.
Crazy. So yeah, I so ridiculous. In Australia, announcements for politicians and all of that are made because the politicians or their officers will send out a press release to the media and say, hey, we're doing this. There's going to be an announcement, and they'll walk out of their office or meet the media in a park or something. They'll make their statement, possibly take a few questions, and then it's all done. So obviously over here, it's a whole big thing. I got my invite via text message. Do you want to go to this thing? I'm like, sure, I'll go.
I love your attitude. You're like, yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, I try and say yes to everything. And because I don't have my dog anymore, because I unfortunately lost him, I made a promise to myself that while I'm footloose and fancy free, because obviously when you choose to have an animal, you have a responsibility. And so you have to have people that can take care of your animal and sort of help you out. And that's a lot. So while I don't have those responsibilities, which because of that, I would sometimes say, look, no, I actually can't make it because I just can't. I'm like, yes to everything, every opportunity. And so I said, sure, but I never received any information. I just knew what day it was happening. And I was like, all right. And so I just assumed, and this is why you should never assume, it was an evening thing. And so then, because the night before I was talking to one of Bobby's best friends and I said something about the party tomorrow night, he's like, I'm flying out at 6. What are you talking about? Anyway, he's then, I'm here for an announcement. I'm like, yes, that's happening at the party. And he says, it's happening at 10 a.m. And I look at everybody around me and they're all nodding. And I went, okay. And he said, what party are you going to? And I said, I think I'm going to the party that I'm starting. Like, I don't actually know.
Party.
So that's where the disconnect happened because of how politics is run. And I just assumed, being such a big event, I just assumed it would be the evening. So I did thankfully get up. I did make it into the room, and I was in the third row for the whole thing. But just the vibe of the whole thing, I mean, it was something like somewhere between 1,100 and 1,500 people in that room. And as an Australian, we watch American movies, and so we get a vibe or an understanding of how all of this stuff functions. But to actually be there and see it playing out in real life is something else. So you know how you guys have the drapes, the sort of half circle drapes with
yes.
red, white, and blue.
Yeah.
So they're hanging over the balcony of all the second row. You've obviously got security at an incredible level. I mean,
of course, right.
He's announcing he's running for president. He's a Kennedy. There's obviously things that have gone on in that family. And he's also not the favorite Kennedy because of what he's been fighting for. Right. And so there's all these factors at play, and then just so many people in the room. So the energy was incredible. There was a former congressman that came out and spoke, and he was an older gentleman. I cannot for the life of me remember his name. And I really enjoyed him speaking. And then Bobby came out and sort of made his announcement. And, you know, with the signs and everybody holding up their signs and what have you, I did think about bringing mine back because, again, in Australia, nobody would ever hold a sign for a politician unless they're protesting them, like saying, no, we disagree with you.
Right.
So that in itself was a whole thing. But not only that, watching someone, there was no teleprompter, there was no written speech, and to watch him ad lib for an hour and 47 minutes was just incredible. And I think even if you don't agree with his policies, agree with his stance, you have to respect this man. And I think the other thing is, after the last, and it doesn't matter whether you love or hate Trump, he's not a great orator. He's just not.
He's hilarious.
Right? Exactly. You can't help but laugh, but he doesn't do himself any favors. And then we've got Biden, who can't string two sentences together. And so to watch this man ad lib and have cognitive, cohesive thoughts,
and
huge.
He has just such a presence about him too. And he speaks so eloquently, and he's completely knowledgeable. And I mean, I hope, honestly, he's the curse breaker of that Kennedy family.
It would be amazing. And on full disclosure, It was, I'm trying to think what week it was. It was probably the second week in April. David and I did a show where we broke down his chart. We
Oh,
didn't
you
have
did?
his,
Okay. I may
yeah,
not
we
have
didn't
missed
have
that.
his birth time. I can't remember what date it was, but we didn't have his birth time. So we had to do it just on date of birth and obviously year. But he's got some pretty incredible aspects in his chart that looking at sort of blew my mind. The other thing is, I was at an event one day and I was watching him from afar because he was meant to be leaving and he jumped out of his car and then he was swarmed. And I looked at a friend of mine that day and I said, do you think he'll ever run for president? And she said, no, he's got too many skeletons in his closet. And I mean, he's openly talking about this. I'm not speaking out of school.
Right.
And I said, I've heard people talk about someone being presidential, and I haven't met any president, so I don't know who is or who's not. But I am watching this man, and I've never met someone where I thought, you are so presidential. And I don't know if it's in their upbringing, as in the Kennedys' upbringing, or if it's just in his genes. But yeah, charisma is an understatement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, he had that Kennedy presence, and it feels good when you listen to him speak. And it's powerful and it gets into your soul. And I think we need somebody like him. Hopefully, of course, being the conspiratorial mindset here, I have that. It's hard to trust, all of us are in that realm of like not trusting, the show of the whole politics and, where we've just seen it's just been such a fucking shit show, clown show. It's hard to trust, but there's something in me that just feels that again, he's breaking that Kennedy curse for some reason,
I just think moving forward, we need good people that want to fight for the American people versus the establishment. And the reality is, in politics right now, there are so many people that are entrenched in this whole system. You look at what Pelosi and I'm having a mental blank. Mitch McConnell earn in a year what their salary is, but then you look at what they take home a month. It will blow your mind. Where are those hundreds of thousands of dollars every month coming from? So no matter which candidate it is, it's just time for people to actually get into politics for the right reason, not as a way to just line their pockets and do whatever is going on at the moment.
Yeah, actually serve the American people. They've forgotten that they're here for us. They're here to serve us. It's not the other way around.
It's meant to be for the betterment of the people in the country, not themselves and not the corporations.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just a sad state of affairs where the United States is right now. But I do have hope. I do believe a lot of people are waking up. I do believe that the more shenanigans they pull, I think the more people will stand up and realize like, no. The internal instinct has now kicked in, right? For a lot of people of questioning, which is great because we saw the last 3 years, nobody was not nobody, but a lot of people did not question anything. So I know we're running a little later, but I have two more questions. Since I watch you on Full Disclosure, what have you learned? I know you're newer to astrology and all of that, but what have you learned about yourself, knowing more about your birth chart and your human design? Do you feel that has changed anything in you in terms of like knowing yourself a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. I always had an interest in astrology, and I found David, I think I started following his Facebook page when he only had 5,000 followers. And I was like, this is amazing. And so I would go to my different modeling jobs. I remember I was working for Maya, which is a huge department store in Australia, and I would go in there to shoot regularly for them. And I would turn up and people would go, this is what's going on. And half the studio would end up in our particular area because I would be telling them what was going on with the astrology. And so it was just from watching David's dailies and things like that. So just watching him through that time gave me an understanding for what the planets sort of do and the effect they have on us as a collective. And I thought that was a really great way to learn initially. And then working with him, I've been slowly doing his astrology courses, which is so amazing. And I wish I had more time to dedicate so I could kind of just power through and just focus on it, but I just don't have the time. So it's more sort of when I have a chance. And I've got a lot of astrology books that I sort of read and reference. So often it comes up when something's affecting me personally. But I think what it's taught me so far is, one, it makes more sense as to who I am and why I am the way I am. So I didn't understand that I had 3 planets in Pisces. So even though I'm a fire sun and I'm all fire, I have so much water in my chart. And so Mars, Venus, and Mars, Venus, and Mercury, all in Pisces. And I've always had other gifts and it sort of runs in my family. And I remember Brian was looking at my chart and he said, no wonder you're so witchy. It's all all this Piscean energy. And so everyone sort of sees that. And then I've got a lot of Gemini as well. And so they're like, okay, this makes a lot more sense. And so understanding that the Gemini is why I talk so much, all of that sort of stuff just made me make sense sort of to myself a little bit more. And it also, we were talking before we started, you're a Scorpio sun. Scorps are my favorite people in the world. And if you just look at sort of an astrology book and go compatibility, Aries and Scorp.
Oh, we're supposed to butt heads a lot.
Right? It's not that, it's meant to be a tougher relationship. And I kept saying to people, why do I love Scorps? And my greatest relationships have been with Scorpio men. I don't.
Because you have the Pisces, you have that water element.
Correct. And that's how we connect. And I don't necessarily know what their charts are because I've asked one of my exes, I'm like, tell me. And he keeps saying, I was born when my mother was screaming. I'm like, thank you. That's very helpful. I want to know what the clock on the wall said. So that's astrology, but it was through this that I learned about human design. And that
right, mind blown,
blew my mind. So when I first started working at HighVibe, I had Anne saying to me, what's your human design? What's your human design? I'm like, I don't know. Like, what's your human design? So we ran my chart and I'm a manifester. And so people would say, what's your human design? I'd go, I'm a manifester. Okay. And that was the end of that. And then it was probably a year later, I started really looking into human design and any gaps that I had with astrology, human design filled in. And the other thing for me is I found the language in human design really sort of clunky. And I would sometimes be offended by phrases or words that were used to describe my chart. But then when I started reading further into it and looking into it and read what they meant by the sort of descriptive words that were used, it made sense. And so the offense drifted away. The other thing is it taught me, rather than fighting myself, to accept myself as I am and as my human design is, and to better function within that, which makes my life better, more fulfilling, and I guess more productive. I don't put that pressure on myself that I'm not conforming to everybody else's standards. And the other thing that I found really interesting with human design was that for years when people would say, describe yourself, I would describe myself, and there are particular sentences or phrases I used to use. When I really started getting into human design, those same phrases would come up in describing me. Wow. Just in their literature. So that's been a huge one for me. And I didn't feel that I had a good grasp of it, but I did an interview with Dylan, the human design maven, just a couple of weeks ago. And I think it's one of the best interviews that I've seen, because I mean, I let him do most of the talking. But we kind of go through all the basic parts of human design so that once you have that understanding, it's easy to go off and explore and get a deeper understanding of that. So that's what human design has done for me.
Beautiful. I just feel that people really do need to know about their birth chart and their human design and gene keys, and just learn more about themselves, because I feel a lot of us, like you said, battle ourselves, and we go against our own design of how we're supposed to function. And
Because we're trying to conform. And the other
right.
thing that I just want to add to what you said, I think it's also really, really important for parents to understand their children's design. That to me, because one of the things for me growing up, knowing that I'm a manifester, and I used to irritate people, and my not self is frustration, which could be seen as anger. And if you had have asked my family when I was younger if I had anger problems, they would say, absolutely.
Right.
The reality was, when people would actually take a moment to say to me, what is wrong? I would say, I am frustrated. Nobody is listening to me. And frustrated was really the key word. And I think had my mum, and my mum was very spiritual, but had she had an understanding of who I was versus trying to get me to conform, which is what we spend most of our lives sort of being told we need to do. We need to conform, whether it's to our families' sort of wants, needs, whatever it is, or society's version of what we're meant to be. But if you as a parent have an understanding of who your child is, it makes it easier for you to parent them and for them to grow up and be able to express themselves so that there is a deeper understanding for both of you.
I find that so beautiful and absolutely true. I mean, God, if my mom would have been able to know how to nurture me instead of, I have a Latina mom, so she had the hard hand. And I'm a sensitive soul, I have my Scorpio sun, my Sag rising, my moon in Pisces, and I felt things deeply. I feel people deeply. And so for me, I took on a lot as a kid, and not knowing how to, expressing myself was seen as like, oh, you're just too emotional or hysterical. And I wasn't hysterical, but I was definitely very like shut down in the sense of not expressing myself because it got, it wasn't good to express myself.
And what is your human design?
I'm a 3-5 manifesting generator. So yeah, I forget what it is. It's a something, not the heretic martyr or emotional. Yeah, I'm an emotional manifesting generator, of course.
It makes sense.
Yeah. So basically, I have to sit with things. And once it feels right, like I can't, although I do, because I have that Sag rising, like I know what I want. And if I want it, I'll go for it, whatever. But certain things that I'm not sure, I have to sit with them and then I decide. But once I make a choice, I make a choice. There's no going back. So I'm very firm in that. And I have Mars and Leo. So I'm like very, very direct. So a lot of people find that offensive too.
Oh, I understand. I don't mess around.
Yeah.
And I'm also in numerology. I'm a master number. I'm a 33. So everything about me is very powerful. And being a manifester, I've got a closed and repelling aura. And that for me was one of the biggest things to understand, because at first I'm like, now I'm repelling people. And it was like, no, but you have this huge aura that no matter where you go, you make an impact. And because of that, some people will just not like you because you make them uncomfortable. And it was understanding that it's not anything I'm doing. I'm not doing anything wrong. It's just that I am too much for them, and that's okay.
That's okay.
So that was a big thing, because I would always sit there and go, I swear I'm nice.
It's just an energetic thing. Some people are gonna be drawn to it. Like I'm drawn to you 100%. And so it's just an energetics thing with everyone.
Absolutely.
And whatever. Nobody and not everybody's gonna fucking like you, in the end.
Absolutely.
And those are things that as you age, you learn to accept, and you're just like, fuck it. I don't, no worries. But I get it 100%. Sometimes I walk into the room and like, depending on my energy, I can shift the energy into a very positive thing, or I can shift it into a negative thing. But usually, I'm on the positive side. So, but
Yeah.
either I attract those, magnetize those people to me that, feel that good energy, or completely repel and they hate me. So between.
Yeah. I have friends that invite me to parties just because they essentially, if they're worried about all the groups, not so much getting along, but just interacting, they just let me loose. I'm like, hi. And I just kind of take over the whole thing. And I don't mean to, it's just who
You
I
are.
am.
Yeah.
It just is what it is. They're like, okay, if you need anyone to get things going, just send her in.
Yeah, you're warm, you're open, you're not afraid to talk to people, and it's just beautiful to see. Last thing, so I
Yes.
won't take up too much more of your time. So you have followed your dreams and it's led you to amazing places. What advice do you give people out there who are, feeling stuck, or, not moving forward? What would you say to them in terms of like, keep on following your dreams? You never know where it's going to lead you. Like your path, you just kept saying yes to things, and here you are.
So I'm about to answer the question, but I just want to preface this by saying I had somebody come after me one day on Instagram because he's like, to manifest, you shouldn't have to do anything. You should be able to sit there and manifest everything. And I just disagree
Okay.
with that.
Yeah.
I'm like, what am I meant to do? Sit there like Buddha and just sort of go, this is what I want. So I think it's a combination of things. I think first of all, you have to be realistic about what you can achieve. And I don't mean dreaming small, but if I sort of came out and said, I want to be a singer, that is the most unrealistic thing in this world. No amount of training is going to get me to be able to sing on key. It's not. I sound like a cat being strangled. So there has to be a recognition of, first of all, is this a realistic thing?
Right.
You can have ridiculously big dreams. I'm not saying don't do that, but it has to be something that you can actually do or you can learn to do. So for me, I've always sort of approached things and gone, right, what's the bigger picture? What do I want? Then when you see the big picture, so it's like this big and you're over here going, how on earth do I get over here? Because it's such a huge divide. So at that point, you put steps in place. What do I need to do to be able to make that happen? So rather than focusing on this goal over here, you're looking at what the first step is. So for me, I wanted to make the shift into presenting. So back in, I think it was even before The Bachelor, I think it was around 2008, because that was around the time I had my first hosting job. I went and did a couple of courses. And they're probably not the best courses, but they gave me a grounding for understanding how the camera worked. It made me understand I had to watch myself back. As much as I hate it, I hate listening to myself. I think my accent sounds terrible, all of that. But it,
It sounds perfect.
but this is the whole thing, right? Whenever we hear our own voices, generally, there are some people on this earth that do enjoy looking at themselves and watching themselves, and Godspeed, I wish I was them. But I learned I had to do all of these things to get rid of the little quirks that we have, right? So, I used to do this thing because it started that I would say and so a lot. So I stopped all of that. But then I started, because you get these nervous little tics. So it's all those little things. So you work on that. And then once you achieve that, you move on to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And suddenly when you sort of are assessing where you are, so you still want to get over here, but you're not here anymore, you're here. So that gap's not so big. On the journey, I think the biggest thing is fear that we face. And it's fear that we're not good enough, fear because other people will tell us that we can't do it. When I talked about moving over here, I had people, good friends of mine, I say good friends, I thought they were good friends of mine, saying, it's never going to happen. Do you know how many people have gone over and they can't make it work? And I said, well, just because they couldn't doesn't mean I can't. And then it was something I couldn't let go of. So for me, there was the fear. I owned property in Australia. I was very comfortable. I had a great career happening. I had all these things going on, but I'm still there just like, what on earth is going on? So my decision was, I have to give this a go. And if I lose my house, I can always earn more money. By the time my visa was approved, it was a 3-year visa, but by the time they approved it, it was 2.5 years. So I remember saying to my dad at the time, at worst, I go on a 2.5-year adventure and I come back and I get a 9 to 5 and I sort of get on with life. And he goes, okay. And so that was the decision that was made. It doesn't mean doing it wasn't difficult. There were days you move into a house where you have no furniture, you have nothing except a TV and a bed. And I was sitting on the floor. I didn't even have dishes. And, you don't have a friend or family base. And so you're there, you're dealing with this and you're dealing with loneliness. So at the time I used to drive myself to the Grove. I wouldn't speak to anybody, but I would buy tickets to 2 movies and I would leave a gap in between so I could go and get dinner, and I would go and sit in a restaurant. I would have a beautiful dinner. I would read a book. I'd go to the second movie and then I would go home. And that was how I would sort of get my fill energetically of other people. And it sounds really sad, but I mean, it was fine and you kind of make do, but I understood that I was doing this because there was something that I was chasing and something that I needed. So
it was actually brave. Not a lot of people would do that. Not a lot of people would go to, especially women, go to dinner on their own.
I love having dinner on my own. You get to people watch. I always take a book because I always have a book that I'm reading, and I'm not embarrassed to read a book at a table. I'm fine. But I also know that I'm someone who does do okay being on their own. Lockdown didn't scare me in terms of being cut off from people. I was fine. I do all my weird things in my house on my own, like we're good. But I say this to sort of highlight that to do these things isn't easy. I know when we look at social media and we see somebody who's succeeding and we go, oh my God, look at what they did. Yes, it's amazing. Yes, it probably looks like it was easy. It probably looks like they picked up their life. They came over here and, they did these things, they met these people, and then they get to this point. But that's only one part of the story. There are all these other things in between where you sometimes have to sacrifice. So let's say it's someone starting a business. You might have to sacrifice your weekend. You might be working 16 to 18 hours every single day to get that business off the ground, to keep overheads low, to get the merchandise out and do all of that. Right. But if the payoff in a couple of years is that you have a successful business and by then you've got a few employees and you can sort of manage that work-life balance a little bit better, but you are so happy because you're doing what sets your soul on fire, for me, that's worth it. One of the people that told me I couldn't do it called me, I think it was a couple of years later, and he said, I owe you an apology. And I said, okay. And he said, I told you that you couldn't do this. And I said, yeah, you did. And he said, I'm realizing I told you that because I couldn't. I wasn't brave enough. I didn't go and do it. And because I couldn't, I figured nobody else could. And he said, but I'm watching you and you're doing it. And I appreciated that so much. But so for me, it's all about breaking it down and putting it into manageable steps that you can achieve. And you've got to keep popping your head up every now and again and looking at the end goal, but focusing on just getting that next step done. Because when you do that and you're focused on that, as opposed to sort of, oh my gosh, I'm here, I'm so far away, all of a sudden you've achieved so much that you didn't even realize you were achieving. And I think when you look and it is overwhelming, that's a reason people give up. I think the fear is a reason why people give up, but you have to trust the universe. And if this is something you can't stop thinking about,
then you'll do it, right?
This is where you have to be brave. And you know what? I always say, what's the worst that could happen? And that's a question that I ask everybody whenever they're thinking about something. Now, if the worst is you might die, maybe it's a bigger conversation. But if the worst is I might fail and people will see that, okay, but at least you tried.
Right.
So that's my logic with everything. You just sort of have to give it a go. And I have not regretted a single decision that I have made. The universe has caught me every single time. And the other thing is, you've got to be brave and reach out to people. So with these interviews, I had wanted to reaching out to Bigtree, and there were a whole bunch of people that I reached out to. Most of them didn't get back to me. So many people will ignore you and all of that unless you've got huge numbers to back it up. But then I remember I'd watched an interview with Tess Lawrie, and I was like, this woman is fascinating. I'd seen Pierre Corey's testimony before Congress, and I thought he was phenomenal. And I was so intrigued by the whole ivermectin situation. So I reached out. I couldn't find contact details for any of them. Then there was a journalist who had done an interview, and I'd seen it on Twitter, I think, of all places. And she had done an interview with Tess Lawrie. Anyway, this woman randomly started following me on Twitter. And so all of a sudden, because she followed me, and she's got hundreds of thousands of people following her, but that meant I could message her. So I don't even have 1,000 followers on Twitter. Like, I'm not particularly active. I watch more than I post. But I sent her a message and said, hey, this is what I'm doing. I'm just after a contact number for Tess Lawrie. She asked me a few questions, and I got Tess's contact information. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. And so I interviewed Tess, and that interview, when it was pulled off YouTube, was sitting at, I want to say 39,000 views and climbing rapidly. It was a fantastic interview. I've since reposted it on my Rumble account. I think it's the very first video I ever posted. It's probably a bit outdated now, but it was because I persisted and because of that sort of lack of fear. I knew this woman could say, no, I'm not passing on these details. But by being bold, I got Tess's information, which led to Pierre Corey's information. And that was another huge interview, which again, YouTube took down when it was climbing in terms of the views. I think it was the second most viewed interview on the channel at the time. So you just have to go for it. You have to be prepared to hear the word no. You have to be prepared for failure and all of that sort of stuff. But you also have to prepare and believe in success. And then trust the universe.
Yeah. And I feel that the right people will come along and give you that helping hand that you never know, right? You just never know who's going to show up. You know, if you think about something, I want this, and then all of a sudden it comes from a completely different direction or different person than what you had envisioned. But
and sorry, I was just going to say, and sometimes it comes much later than what you would have thought or you would have liked. And I was fortunate enough recently to meet Pierre Corey in person, because we'd obviously spoken via Zoom. And when we did the interview, that interview runs about an hour. We spoke for 2 hours after we were done filming. We just talked about everything. And then I've obviously watched him since then. And from our personal conversation to where he is now, I watched his views on certain things shift, and I was really intrigued. Anyway, I went to meet some friends of mine, and Pierre was there. So I said, hi, Pierre, I just want to introduce myself. And it ended up being that he and I sat huddled up for about an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours, lost in conversation. And what we figured out was I was one of the first people to interview him after he addressed Congress. Nobody would speak to him.
Wow.
And I reached out and said, hey, I want to do this. And he went, sure. So this is why you never know. You just have to go for it.
I love it. I love it so much. Natalie, it's been such a joy to finally actually get person, and hopefully soon we'll do like a HighVibe thing. I know there's some stuff going on over there, and I'd love to meet you in person. I know you have something coming up. Tell us what's going on with you, where people can reach you. You have an event coming up, right? That you're going to attend, or I forget what it was. It the survival?
Oh, yes. So I'm thinking, which event? Yes, there is an event on that's happening in Beverly Hills. I will be posting the the graphics of it to my Instagram stories. So all my social media is Miss Natalie Sady.
Okay.
So you can find me there, Facebook, Instagram. There is a website. I haven't updated that in a little while. That's just nataliesady.com. And then there is a YouTube channel and a Rumble channel, which is where you can find all of my interviews. So you can sort of see the work that I've done. The Tess Laurie and Pierre Corey interviews are there, even though they're, like I said, a little bit older, but they're still incredibly interesting and powerful interviews. But this survival event is really, a lot of people talk about the EMP strikes that could happen if we have a massive solar flare and we lose power, massive earthquake. There's obviously tornadoes and hurricanes and all these things that could go on. And we're always sort of told, have an earthquake kit ready. But we're told, 3 days of water, 3 days of food. The reality is, if there is a really big disaster, and nobody's wishing for this to happen, but you need to be prepared, and for more than 3 days. And so your little kit with maybe a torch and some batteries, it's not going to be enough. And Steve, who is going to be speaking at the event and presenting it, he's an expert in disaster preparedness. Okay. So this is about understanding how to navigate if, because if there's a huge solar flare, we could, pardon me,
it's okay,
we could have huge issues with our cars because the starters are electronic. So that means our cars won't work. Things like that. So if the cars aren't working, how do we navigate? How do we get around? How do we do things? If there is something wrong with the roads and the freeways, how do we navigate and get to where we need to go? And he actually has answers to all of this. Beautiful. What is it you need to be able to access fresh drinking water for a longer period of time if the water isn't flowing, all that sort of stuff. So that's happening in Beverly Hills. I will give you the date. I think it's Thursday the 24th. Thursday the 25th is when that's happening. So just check my social media. Details for that will be there. I think it's $10 a ticket. Oh, so when you register, you get the address. And for anyone that can't make it, I'm actually interviewing Steve the following Wednesday. So we'll be rehaving that conversation, and that will be available on the YouTube channel.
Wonderful, wonderful. And make sure to send me all the links to your Rumble. I'd love for people to see those interviews that are banned just so they can get a refresher, or if they don't, anyways, I'd love for people to see that. And of course, I'll link everything in the show notes. Please bear in mind, I'm still working on making sure everything is linked and all of that. But once again, thank you so much for your time. And I just really, like I said, I'm super drawn to you, and you're just such a warm and open soul, and I just resonate with you. And every time, full disclosure comes on, I'm always like, if I'm awake, I'm always like, putting my 2 cents in. And, a few times you've actually commented my comment. So it's been great. And just getting to know you personally has been so wonderful. And I'm so lucky. So I'm so happy you came on. And I, again, appreciate your time. So
well, thank you so much for having me and giving me this platform to be able to talk about these things, because often I don't actually get to share my story. So it's incredible that anybody wants to hear it, but thank you so much.
Of course, we want to hear women's stories, especially because you are from Australia. It's good to know different points of view, from somebody, an outsider. Well, yes, you've lived here for a while, right? But you're definitely from another country, and you grew up there. So it's interesting to see your perspective on what's going on here, and also what was going on back home. And your story is just great, coming from modeling, like the relationship abuse and all of that, and just leading to what you're doing now, just major things, and interviewing big people is just, it's beautiful to see. So I've loved to see your journey and where you go next. So
that's all up to the universe, isn't it?
Well, I'm an avid follower, so just know that.
Well, thank you so much. I so appreciate it.
Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and I'm sure I'll see you tomorrow night.
Absolutely.
Have a good night. Thank you.
You too. Bye.
Bye.